There's been much debate here in the Senate this week, and outside the Senate for that matter, over housing. The government unsuccessfully tried to force a vote on two of its housing policies, the Build to Rent and Help to Buy scheme. Now, in reality, these schemes would help only a modest number of buyers and renters. The debate this week was more about drawing some election battle lines. Labor wanting voters to know that it's at least trying to find solutions here, but is being frustrated in the Senate by the Greens on the left and the Coalition on the right. But what are the answers to Australia's housing crisis? This will undoubtedly be a big election issue, and I'm keen to explore what really needs to change to deliver more supply and greater affordability. I'm David Speers on Ngunnawal Country at Parliament House in Canberra. Welcome to Insiders on Background. Well, when you look around for an example of a city that's got it right when it comes to housing, it turns out we don't have to look too far. Auckland took a bold decision some years ago to adopt a more liberal approach to zoning laws, allowing more apartments and townhouses to be built. And the results, when it comes to housing affordability, are stark. Take a look at this. Rental prices in Auckland have remained relatively flat since the change compared to Wellington and the rest of New Zealand. House prices have also risen at a much slower rate. Stuart Donovan is an urban economist who works with the New Zealand think tank Motu, but now lives in Brisbane and joins me for this chat. Stuart, thanks so much for joining us. Look, tell us a bit about Auckland. What did they do some years ago and what change has it delivered?
Yes, so Auckland historically has had very, very poor housing outcomes, I would say. It's relatively expensive, probably second only to Sydney in the Australian context. And what happened about 2016 is they adopted, as you said, a sort of widespread upzoning to allow a lot more apartments, but especially townhouses. And the response to that policy change was really rapid and large, and a lot more houses were built. And how in the subsequent years and housing affordability has improved, as you noted.
And so that's played out in terms of house prices, rental prices and social housing as well?
Yes, that's correct. So one of the interesting findings was overall housing supply increased rapidly. The share of social housing in the sort of new housing that was being built tripled from about 3% before the change to about 10% after the change. So it really did enable a lot more private and public housing to be built. And there's some good reasons for that. You know, the sorts of houses that they enabled are the sorts of houses that a lot of social housing providers want to provide. So that
yeah, and I was going to ask you that, what the sort of housing we're talking about, not just social housing, but for buyers and private renters as well. What are we talking about? A mega high rise, or is it that sort of mid-level, medium density?
Yeah, more the latter. So the Auckland upzoning is notable because it was very widespread. It was about 3/4 of the urban area got upzoned, but the actual upzoning was quite modest in terms of the density that was allowed. So the key typology that really came through and surged after the upzoning was townhouses. The number of townhouses being built increased 12-fold. The number of apartments did increase as well, but much more modestly. And that reflects that the upzoning really just emphasized medium density housing up to about five, 6, 7 stories at most, more so than high rise.
So here's the question, how do they do it? I mean, we all know efforts, and we're seeing it playing out in Sydney at the moment where the New South Wales government is trying to change zoning laws there, but facing that inevitable pushback, the NIMBYism, those suburbs that worry about changing the character of their area, worry about infrastructure not being there, schools, hospitals, transport, and so on. How did Auckland manage to do this?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think Auckland sort of arose from the convergence of issues. And I think it's important to note that the housing affordability in Auckland was very bad to begin with. And that created sort of a social license for change. I think that social license exists in Sydney too, because obviously affordability outcomes there are terrible there as well. And the other contributing factor is there was an amalgamation of councils in 2010 that basically required them to develop a new planning rule book. And so that requirement created the opportunity basically for central government to come in and say, we want you to take this opportunity to enable a lot more housing. So that is a little bit unique in that context, but it's somewhat similar to what I see playing out in New South Wales and Sydney at the moment.
Well, I guess it's a bit of a constitutional or governance question there, isn't it? You mentioned central government coming in and saying, we've got to do this. Is that what is required in the Australian context as well? Because we know local councils will face resistance and will respond to that pushback.
Yes, I think it's fairly clear that the state governments need to demonstrate more leadership on housing. They have a clear role in it. It's been very promising to see some of the developments in New South Wales. I think my observation looking at the New Zealand experience is that the sort of the push to tackle housing affordability really started around about 2011, but it took several years to get going. And that push started under a centre-right government at the time that I think took housing affordability seriously, and they were making progress by about 2015, 2016. But that progress was too slow to keep up with the public sentiment. And so what happened is that by the time the 2017 election came around, public sentiment on housing affordability had shifted so much that the government, which had actually been quite proactive about improving, taking steps to improve housing affordability, were booted out. And that's when Jacinda Ardern's Labor government was voted in. So I think that's a warning for politicians, I think. I'm not a political strategist, I should say. I'm an economist.
Fair enough. But just sticking to what's happened in the market there, the housing market, what's affordability like now in Auckland compared to, I guess, Wellington in New Zealand, but the Australian context as well? What do you get for your buck in Auckland at the moment?
Yeah, so the way to understand Auckland at the moment is it's about it's more affordable than Sydney, but it's less affordable than Melbourne and Brisbane. But the gap has narrowed. So because they've enabled a lot more supply and prices have moderated, the gap between Auckland and Brisbane is now very small. And it wouldn't at all surprise me if in the next couple of months Auckland becomes more affordable than Brisbane. Brisbane actually downzoned in 2017 and made it a lot harder to build townhouses. So there's examples in the Australian context of us actually going the other way. The wrong way, you might say.
If townhouses are the way to go, if the Auckland example is that medium density townhouses, what has that meant for the city? For some of the much loved suburbs and so on? How should people worried about this increasing density view it? What's it done to the lifestyle in Auckland?
Yeah, well, obviously there's divergent views on this. There'll be people who say that the explosion in townhouses has undermined the character of the area. I think it's interesting though, because the people who live in those areas who experience a lot of construction, they also benefit from, to some extent, higher property values, because when your property is upzoned to enable more housing, it becomes more valuable. So there is a bit of they get a bit of compensation for that, I would say. I think it does it does highlight the need for complementary sort of design policy changes. So one of the things New Zealand has done is remove the requirement to provide parking pretty much universally across the country. And that enables a lot nicer, kind of more compact townhouses where you don't just have all these driveways and things like that. So it does increase the need for sort of some architectural and urban design sort of considerations. But to be honest, I think, the effects have been so pronounced, it'd be hard to say that it wasn't worth doing.
And are you able to say whether that concern around infrastructure keeping up with the infill, what's happened there in Auckland, whether it's transport, schools, other infrastructure, has that kept up?
So I think the interesting thing about infrastructure is that zoning is a very poor way to manage the loads placed on infrastructure. In the Auckland context, what they're now looking at, for example, for transport is congestion pricing, so time of use road pricing, because that's a much more direct way to manage the demands that are placed on the road network. And similarly, there's some water reforms that are working through. So I think it is fair to say that it kind of creates the need for policy reforms to improve the way that we supply infrastructure and the way that we manage infrastructure. But I wouldn't really accept infrastructure problems as being a reason not to upzone, because there's much better policy tools for addressing those infrastructure problems, and upzoning just sort of forces you to look at those policy tools a bit harder.
So when we look at what's happening in Australia, there are some states, New South Wales, the example that we mentioned, that's trying to change those zoning rules. The federal government, for its part, argues it has a long list of things that it's doing. It's got its Housing Australia Future Fund for social and community housing. It's given money for the states to incentivise them to build more private dwellings as well. It's struggling to get through, as mentioned this week, Help to Buy and Build to Rent. What do you make of this suite of policies and the difference or lack of impact they're having?
So I think the shift in rhetoric is encouraging. The fact that people are talking about housing affordability more is very encouraging. My observation would be that the total sum of the policies that have been announced are just really don't reflect the severity of the problem that we're facing, and the fact that it's going to take a lot more significant policy change to get on top of it, particularly around supply. So things like, helping first home buyers buy a house, that's really just subsidizing demand. It's basically saying we're going to enable a certain part of the market to have a leg up and get into a house easier. But of course,
and would that be the same for the coalition's idea of letting people dip into their super to buy a first home?
Exactly. I mean, giving people more money to compete for the existing stock of housing is generally just going to push up the price, and maybe tilt it in favor of first-time buyers over investors and renters. And I feel like it's kind of missing the point, which is that there's too few houses to buy or to rent. And so until we get, I think, greater recognition of that, I think the New South Wales government recognizes that because they talk about supply being core to their efforts, but I'm not sure at the federal government whether I see it. And that's a comment that I would make across the political spectrum. So it's not a criticism of the government over the other parties. I haven't heard any of the parties really articulate clearly that we need to enable more supply in the locations where people want to live.
Yeah, and look, we can't have a housing discussion in Australia, it seems, without negative gearing coming into the debate. We know the Greens want to radically change negative gearing capital gains tax rules, along with freezing rents and so on. But on negative gearing and those tax incentives there, again, some argue, well, that's not going to help supply either if you wind those back. What do you think?
I think there's good reasons to refine those tax settings, and maybe make them less generous. But I would do that from a tax perspective. I don't think it's really going to shift the dial on housing supply either way. And I think it's a bit of a red herring in that sense. So yes, these tax settings might make a difference to prices at the margin, but I wouldn't expect it to be the key determinant.
So listening to what you're saying here, supply, this is the solution. A lot of that does rest, though, with state governments in the Australian context. I suppose the federal government would argue it's offering billions to incentivise them to make change. Is that enough?
So I think the one other policy apart from supply, we can come back to it if you'd like, is the Commonwealth rent assistance. So providing direct income support, that is very beneficial and very immediate. And so that I think if you really want to help people on low incomes with housing, that's one of the most effective policy tools you have. And then on the supply side, I think the incentives that the federal government is providing are good in principle, but my understanding is that they take a long time to kick in. So because they're backwards looking, they take a long time to flow through to the councils, and you've got to ask whether they're actually affecting political or policy decisions now or soon enough, because my understanding is that the money that flows through to council is too slow. So I think there's keep the incentives, but we could look at ways of making them more immediate so that the councils that genuinely do enable more housing and build more housing, they get the rewards of that much quicker. I think that would be something to look at.
You're talking about Commonwealth rewards for local governments that make a quick decision or a decision that's going to make a difference quickly. That's something that they need to sit down and work on.
Yes, I think so. I think the financial assistance from the federal level to the local level is a good idea in principle. My understanding is at the moment it's just too slow to actually sort of positively influence local decisions.
Look, again, it comes back to having the community come with you. And you talked earlier about that social licence. Do you think we've got to that point where there's enough social licence that people see the difficulty so many are having to ever get into the housing market that they're willing to make these changes at the local level to see more townhouses up and down the street where they live?
I think it's emerging. My observation would be that the discussion here is about 5 to 10 years behind where New Zealand was. And that's partly because housing outcomes in Australia generally, historically, have been better than New Zealand. That's why so many of us are living here, or one of the reasons. So I think it's got a ways to go in Australia. What I would find encouraging is seeing institutions like the Productivity Commission in New South Wales coming in and contributing to the discussion with a lot of evidence, summarizing the evidence and putting it out there. I find it very encouraging to see a lot of the civil society groups around, pro-housing civil society groups emerging, often driven by young people. And that's something that we saw in New Zealand about 10 years ago as well. So my hunch is that it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. But Australia could learn and move quickly if it looks at what worked in New Zealand and other places.
And just a final question on that. Even if we did all of that, is there still a problem with supply costs, finding construction workers, the sort of tools that we're going to need to get townhouses built? Is that still a short-term issue as well?
Definitely. But I think it's also worth keeping in mind that the capacity of the construction sector is determined with our policies. So if our policies enable more housing and smaller housing, more affordable housing, then the construction sector will respond to that. And that's what we saw in New Zealand. The construction sector actually doubled in size in terms of the workforce over about 10 years. The number of people in apprenticeships almost tripled. So there's definitely things we can do on the sort of industry side to improve the capacity of the industry, but I am fairly optimistic that it would respond. One of the great things about townhouses is that they're quite lightweight construction. So they can be supplied by developers that are currently developing greenfield, so single detached dwellings, but they can also be supplied by apartment developers. So they're quite a nice and easy to deliver product if you enable it.
So the example is there from Auckland, and the challenge is there for politicians to embrace medium density townhouse style living in our Australian cities to help tackle this problem. Stuart Donovan, really appreciate you talking us through this complicated issue, but at least giving an example of where it can succeed. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And if you have any thoughts on this conversation or any ideas for the pod, please drop us a line, insiders@abc.net.au. We'll see you Sunday morning.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.